Smoke rose like a torn banner as the fjord village woke to screams and steel. "Eric Hale," said the sky bleeds, and someone opened our gate. Lysandra Vale smiled without warmth as torches blossomed along the palisade. Lord Magnus Varn said, "Kneel, exile, or drown in your father's shame." Eric Hale said, "I carry that shame like iron, but I do not kneel." The longhouse door burst, and a shaman's rune flared red across wet timber. Old Eamon Grey said, "The omen returns, boy, and it wants a debt repaid." Shields thundered while surf hammered the stones like a war drum. Lysandra Vale said, "Open path, strike fast, leave none to raise a horn." Eric's knuckles whitened around a notched blade blackened by old fire. Lord Magnus Varn said, "Your tribe chose weakness, and I harvest what grows." Eric Hale said, "Then reap thorns, Magnus, because I still stand." A gust hurled sparks through the night, and the village shadows leaned closer. Boats cracked against the jetty, and ravens wheeled as if counting the dead. Eric Hale said, "If fate writes in blood, let it learn my name again tonight." Dawn crawled over slate water, and the village lay in cinders and salt. Eric Hale said, "My blade is black because I burned what I loved once." Old Eamon Grey packed herbs into a leather pouch and stared at the ash. Old Eamon Grey said, "Exile is a road, not a pit, but it eats the soft in you." Eric Hale said, "I walked it before, and it took my brother and my tongue for joy." Rope creaked as the ruined gate sagged, and gulls fought over a fallen helm. Lord Magnus Varna's banners receded across the fjord like a scar that spreads. Lysandra Vale said, "Follow if you dare, Eric, because you always choose fire." Eric felt the clan eyes on his back, counting debts he could not pay. He cinched the wolf cloak, hiding the tremor that ran through his hand. Old Eamon Grey said, "There is a hill of bones beyond the pine, and answers there." Eric Hale said, "If the dead speak, let them curse me honest and point my path." He turned from the home that would not claim him, and the tide took his footprints. Wind drove sleet across the ridge as Eric and Eamon climbed the pine path. Old Eamon Grey said, "Magnus binds men with fear and coin, but his heart is a wound." Eric Hale said, "Wounds fester into kings when no one cleans them." They looked down on the fjord, where longships cut dark scrolls across the bay. Lord Magnus Varn said, "Take the oaths, seize the grain, and break the horns." Village fires answered like stars chained to his will on the far shore. Lysandra Vale rode at his flank, face unreadable beneath a rain's slick hood. Eric Hale said, "She speaks like a friend and strikes like a hawk from the dark." Old Eamon Grey said, "Desire is a mask that forgets its face after the feast." Drums carried over water, and a wolf standard snapped against the wet wind. Eric Hale said, "He is building a wall of hunger and fear, stone by stolen stone." Old Eamon Grey said, "Then we must take his mortar, not just chip at the wall." The sleet cut their cheeks clean and resolve set like iron in cold water. The barrow opened like a cracked tooth, breathing peat and cold secrets. Old Eamon Grey said, "Step soft, boy, or the earth will close you as a pocket." Eric Hale said, "I have slept in worse places than old mouths." Amber light from a tallow lamp drew runes on ribs, stacked like oars. Old Eamon Grey said, "Your blade is dark because you quenched it in betrayal." Eric Hale said, "I quenched it in river mud and shame, and it drinks both still." Eamon set charms on the stone, and a moth traced circles through the smoke. Old Eamon Grey said, "Names anchor rage, so speak the one you hunt." Eric Hale said, "Magnus Varn, and the woman who smiles at doors, Lysandra Vale." The barrow hummed, and frost crept in veins across the flagstones. Old Eamon Grey said, "Find the ally who runs from himself, and trade him a future." Eric Hale said, "I will trade him my past if he can carry it without breaking." The lamp guttered, and the dark leaned close, as if to overhear their oath. Outside, the wind braided pine and sea, and a raven beat time on the sky. Old Eamon Grey said, "When the storm turns, walk east and meet the archer in exile." They found the watcher on a broken tower where the forest met the shore. Cale Thorne said, "If you came for the bounty, you are late and still foolish." Eric Hale said, "I came for a man who aims straighter than his own past." Old Eamon Grey said, "We offer you a future with teeth if your courage still has them." Cale Thorne said, "Courage I have, but it chews me more than I bite back." Wet ropes hissed in the wind, and the tower groaned like an old hull at tide. Eric Hale, said Magnus, builds a throne from our hunger, and I plan to starve him. Cale Thorne said, "The woman with the silver torque warned me you were persuasive." Eric Hale said, "Lysandra smiles as if she forgives, then sells you to your ghosts." Old Eamon Grey said, "Choose a side, Archer, before the storm writes it for you." Cale Thorne said, "I choose the side that shoots first and keeps moving." Eric Hale said, "Then pull with me, and we will draw a line through his heart." Sea spray climbed the tower steps, and three shadows leaned into one purpose. Dawn thinned to pewter as they followed the cliff path above the iron sea. Eric Hale said, "Every step sounds like a verdict." Old Eamon Grey said, "Verdicts pass, but choices echo longer." Cale Thorne said, "Echoes help when they warn of rocks." Gulls wheeled over breakers that gnawed the bones of old piers. Eric Hale said, "I burned a bridge, and the smoke still lives in my lungs." Old Eamon Grey said, "Guilt is a tether unless you cut it with purpose." Cale Thorne said, "Purpose draws fletching on the wind and hunts straight." Pines hissed, and sleet kissed their cheeks like tiny oaths. Eric Hale said, "Magnus wears my past like a trophy, and I want it back." Old Eamon Grey said, "Want is a fire. Turn it to a forge or be ash again." Cale Thorne said, "Then hammer me too, because my metal rang false once." The horizon opened, and the path narrowed, and fear steadied into aim. Across the fjord, a war hall hummed like a hive under tarred beams. Lord Magnus Varn said, "Hunger is a leash and I hold the collar." Lysandra Vale said, "Leashes chafe, so give them silk and rumors." Maps lay pinned by daggers, and black beans marked stolen grain. Lord Magnus Varn said, "Burn the outlying barns and spare the oathmakers." Lysandra Vale said, "Mercy today buys silence when the knives are out." A clerk scratched tallies while rain thrummed like hooves on the roof. Lord Magnus Varn said, "The exile bites, so pull his teeth in the dark." Lysandra Vale said, "I know his gait, and where pride makes him slow." A spear tapped rhythm, and oaths crawled across the room like frost. Lord Magnus Varn said, "Send riders east and close the passes." Lysandra Vale said, "And send a whisper west that draws him into sight." The fire snarled, and the hall smelled of pitch and wet wool. On a wind-sheltered strand, Eamon drew circles in damp sand with his staff. Old Eamon Grey said, "Breath first, then blade, then the world." Eric Hale said, "My breath tastes like cinders when I think of him." Cale loosed blunt arrows at driftwood and watched the strings sing. Cale Thorne said, "Songs keep hands honest when fear lies." Old Eamon Grey said, "Fear is a scout, not a king." Eric moved through cuts that remembered older storms. Old Eamon Grey said, "Your black blade drinks what you feed it, so feed it vow." Eric Hale said, "I vow to take his wall down stone by stolen stone." Cale Thorne said, "And I vow to pick the mortar with feathered steel." Gull shadows slid over the marks, then fled inland before rain. Old Eamon Grey said, "When thunder walks, listen for a second footstep." Eric Hale said, "Whose?" Old Eamon Grey said the price. The sea answered with a long breath and left salt on their tongues. They met the riders in a pine gully where fog clung like wool. Eric Hale said, "Break the first spear and the rest forget their courage." Cale Thorne said, "I will teach the second spear to sleep." Hooves struck mud, and breath plumed from snorting mounts. Old Eamon Grey said, "Strike the knot, not the rope." An arrow kissed a helm, and its song ended a shout. Eric Hale said, "Come take what is not yours, and leave less than you brought." Shields slammed bark, and resin bled as axes found sap. Cale Thorne said, left flank hungry, right flank proud. Old Eamon Grey said, pride steps first, punish it. Eric drove the black blade through a gap like midnight fitting a lock. The gully coughed smoke, and the riders broke into ragged threads. Cale Thorne said, threads pull easy when wet with fear. Silence returned on quick feet, and hid in the ferns. Rain softened to a whisper, as they searched the abandoned waystone. Cale Thorne said, tracks circle twice, and stop like a lie. Old Eamon Grey said, lies leave gifts when they need belief. Eric Hale found a silver thread, snagged on thorn like moon hair. Eric Hale said, torque wire, polished and proud. Old Eamon Grey said, some smiles are smith work, some are traps. Cale Thorne said, a raven's stamp marks this wax, and it knows my name. Eric Hale said, what did it promise? Cale Thorne said, a path that misses graves and lands on glory. Old Eamon Grey said, paths that avoid graves often end inside one. Wind turned the wax to a dark tear on Cale's palm. Eric Hale said, if she draws a circle, I will step in and break it. Cale Thorne said, then draw me a line to hold while you do. The village square cracked with silence after smoke cleared, and faces stared at Eric like a wound. Eric Hale said, your walls are ash because I was not here. A woman spat and turned away. Old Eamon Grey said, blame is a seed, but harvest comes later. Cale Thorne said, seeds rot when no one waters them. Children clutched burnt toys, and their eyes cut sharper than steel. Eric Hale said, I swear my blade will answer, though my name may never heal. Old Eamon Grey said, swear less to others, more to yourself. The clan murmured, some with fists, some with fear. Cale Thorne said, trust is a bowstring, pull too hard and it snaps. Eric felt exile in every glance, heavier than iron. Ravens circled overhead, black mirrors of fate. Fog rolled thick along the riverbank, where Lysandra stood with a white cloth tied to her spear. Lysandra Vale said, I bring no steel, only words. Eric Hale said, your words cut more than blades. Old Eamon Grey said, a wolf does not wear lambskin without reason. Cale Thorne said, if she lies, I will loose first. Lysandra Vale smiled, eyes cold as frost. Lysandra Vale said, Magnus grows careless, and I offer you his throat. Eric Hale said, you deal in traps, why hand me the bait? Lysandra Vale said, because bait can choose its hunter. Silence coiled tighter than rope, and the river swallowed their reflection whole. They followed Lysandra's path into the birchwood, where silence felt too heavy. Eric Hale said, the trees listen like spies. Cale Thorne said, then they heard the lie before we did. Arrows hissed from branches, and bark shattered. Old Eamon Grey said, ambush walks on borrowed time. Eric Hale said, time I will steal back. He drove the black blade upward, splitting a masked raider. Cale Thorne loosed shafts that found throats in the fog. Lysandra Vale said, I warned you Magnus bites hardest in the dark. Eric Hale said, and you showed him where to sink his teeth. Blood mist hung and betrayal pressed closer than the fog. In Magnus's hall, torchlight clawed walls black with smoke. Lord Magnus Varn said, the exile took the bait, as planned. Lysandra Vale said, he bleeds suspicion now, not strength. Magnus poured wine over the map until rivers drowned villages. Lord Magnus Varn said, doubt splits men quicker than axes. Lysandra Vale said, and trust burns faster than dry wood. He gripped her wrist, firelight dancing in his eyes. Lord Magnus Varn said, do not forget your leash. Lysandra Vale said, do not forget I sharpen it. Their laughter cracked the rafters while shadows bent like spies. By a pine fire camp, silence burned louder than crackling logs. Eric Hale said, her words coil in me like worms. Cale Thorne said, Worms find cracks already waiting. Old Eamon Grey said suspicion eats brothers before swords do. Eric Hale said, and still I see her face each time I close my eyes. Cale Thorne said, then open them before she blinds you. Sparks drifted upward like scattered vows. Old Eamon Grey said, doubt her. Doubt him. Doubt even me. But do not doubt your blade. Eric Hale said, the blade is all I trust, and it is darker for it. Shadows swayed long and thin, pointing in different directions. The cave mouth glowed with damp torchlight as Betrayal walked forward. Cale Thorne said, I scouted, and she followed me. Lysandra Vale stepped from shadow, smile sharp as frost. Eric Hale said, you brought her here. Cale Thorne said, I thought she sought Magnus's throat, not mine. Old Eamon Grey said, a mask always fits too well until it cracks. Lysandra Vale said, truth is easier when you want to believe it. Eric's heart hammered, and the black blade pulsed like it remembered her touch. Lord Magnus Varna's voice carried from deeper shadows, cruel and sure. Lord Magnus Varn said, even wolves chase bait when starved long enough. Eric Hale said, you set the snare with my own trust. The torch guttered, and the air closed like a trap. Storm winds shook the mountain pass, and Eamon leaned heavy on his staff. Old Eamon Grey said, the rune scars my chest each time I breathe. Eric Hale said, you hid this sickness? Old Eamon Grey said, wisdom always demands a price. Cale Thorne said, then wisdom is a curse. Eric Hale said, your strength carried us, now we carry you. Eamon lifted his shirt, skin etched with black veins crawling like roots. Old Eamon Grey said, the spirit I bound gnaws me each dawn. Eric Hale said, you gave yourself to hold back shadows. Cale Thorne said, and still they leak through. Old Eamon Grey said, even a dam must break. His breath steamed, and his eyes held both sorrow and fire. At the ruined bridge, raiders poured across broken stone, and Cale loosed arrow after arrow. Cale Thorne said, I will hold them, go. Eric Hale said, you'll be crushed alone. Cale Thorne said, alone is the only way I lived this long. Old Eamon Grey said, sacrifice makes bonds stronger than chains. Cale smiled with bloody teeth as a spear grazed his arm. Cale Thorne said, better to buy your road with my blood than die with empty hands. Eric Hale said, I will not leave you in mud and fire. Cale Thorne said, then carry me in memory when Magnus falls. The black blade hummed with grief, and Eric staggered back under its weight. In the barrow once more, Eric knelt by flickering runes as frost crept from stone. Eric Hale said, the gods mock me with riddles and rot. Old Eamon Grey said, not gods but ghosts that wear their names. Eric pressed his forehead to the black blade, cold burning skin. Eric Hale said, I cannot tell if it is mine or theirs anymore. Old Eamon Grey said, blades take shape from the hand, not the forge. The rune glowed and dimmed, pulse like a dying heart. Eric Hale said, if I break, Magnus wins. Old Eamon Grey said, break or bend, boy, but never bow. Echoes gathered like a chorus, whispering treachery and oaths alike. Magnus stood on the high wall of his hall, wind tearing his cloak like a banner. Lord Magnus Vaughn said, tomorrow the fjord bows, or it burns. Lysandra Vale said, and if the exile strikes first? Lord Magnus Vaughn said, he will find my teeth already in his throat. She smiled faintly, but her eyes wavered like cracked glass. Lysandra Vale said, you trust me too easily. Lord Magnus Varn said, trust is a weapon. I wield it as well as steel. Below, the torches of gathered warriors roared like a sea of flame. Magnus raised his arms, and thunder broke the sky in echo. The marsh swallowed Eric's boots as rain hammered reeds flat. Eric Hale said, each step feels like drowning without water. Old Eamon Grey coughed, leaning on his staff. Old Eamon Grey said, Exile never ends, it just deepens. Cale Thorn said, better mud than Magnus's chain. Lightning bled across the horizon, carving their shadows long. Eric Hale said, shame stalks me closer than his hounds. Old Eamon Grey said, shame is a leash you hold yourself. Cale Thorn said, then cut it now, or it will strangle us both. The marsh groaned, and a raven's cry cracked the silence. The hall erupted in whispers when Lysandra's secret came undone. A rider tossed her torque on the table, gleaming with Magnus's crest. Eric Hale said, so the silver leash was real. Lysandra Vale said, chains are not always worn willingly. Old Eamon Grey said, betrayal never begs forgiveness, only memory. Cale Thorn said, and memory kills quicker than arrows. Lysandra Vale said, I played both sides to survive, but one cut too deep. Eric Hale said, your smile blinded me while my brothers bled. Silence weighed heavier than stone, and firelight danced on accusing faces. Rain dripped from the barrow ceiling as Eamon traced runes with trembling fingers. Old Eamon Grey said, wisdom rots faster than flesh when it festers alone. Eric Hale said, your secrets are graves we keep falling into. Cale Thorn said, and each grave takes one of us. Old Eamon Grey said, I bound a spirit that now eats me whole. Eric Hale said, and still you guide me, half devoured. Old Eamon Grey said, guidance is not without cost, but without it, you are already ash. The rune glowed faintly, a dying ember in a cavern of coal. By the river bend, Cale loosed arrows into raiders who surged through rain. Cale Thorn said, I've run from enough battles, no more. Eric Hale said, your courage burns brighter than my doubt. Old Eamon Grey said even embers can light a pyre. Cale's shaft struck true, and fear rippled through enemy lines. Cale Thorn said, if I fall, let them know I chose the right side at last. Eric Hale said, you will not fall while I breathe. Thunder rolled like drums of war, and the black blade shimmered with a hungry glow. On the ridge, Eric stared east where Magnus's banners gathered like storm clouds. Eric Hale said tomorrow, his wall breaks or I do. Old Eamon Grey said, your blade drinks only what you feed it. Cale Thorn said, feed it vengeance, then let it rest. The wolf cloak snapped in the wind, and fire from torches below licked the dark. Eric Hale said, I will carve his name from my bloodline. Old Eamon Grey said, or carve your own tomb beside his. Cale Thorn said, better a tomb of choice than chains of survival. Their silhouettes stood like carved stone, facing the storm that promised no dawn. The fjord valley thundered as war drums beat against the storm. Eric Hale said, tonight, the earth itself hears us. Old Eamon Grey said, then let it remember more than ash. Cale Thorn said, banners blot the stars, but arrows fly truer in darkness. Fires spread like veins across the hillside, warriors raising shields in rhythm. Eric Hale, said Magnus, comes clothed in thunder, but thunder dies in echo. The black blade trembled, hungry for its reckoning. The shield walls clashed, iron screaming as sparks flew. Eric Hale said, strike, and let no step falter. Cale Thorn said, arrows weave death faster than steel. Old Eamon Grey said, remember oaths, not fear. Raiders broke ranks under relentless volleys, mud drinking their blood. Eric Hale said, every strike carves our names into fate. Thunder rolled as the battle pressed into the heart of the valley. Through rain and blood, Eric found Magnus rising above the melee. Lord Magnus Varn said, exile, your shadow ends tonight. Eric Hale said, then I'll carve mine into your bones. Their blades clashed, steel ringing like broken bells. Magnus's strength drove Eric back, sparks lighting his scar. Eric Hale said, you took my kin, I bring you their ghosts. Lord Magnus Varn said, I take what I wish, and you are nothing. The storm howled as if it bore witness. Eric staggered, knees buckling as Magnus pressed harder. Eric Hale said, I am exile. But exile does not bow. Magnus sneered, strength unbroken. Lord Magnus Varn said, your people spit on you. I claim their loyalty. Eric's black blade pulsed, a dark light bleeding along its edge. Old Eamon Grey shouted, feed it your truth, not your hate. Eric Hale said, truth is sharper than vengeance. With a roar he struck back, sparks scattering like stars torn free. Magnus faltered, Eric's blade buried deep in his chest. Lord Magnus Varn said, exile. Still unworthy. Eric Hale said, worthy enough to end you. Magnus fell, blood mixing with storm water. Cale Thorne said, the wall has broken. Old Eamon Grey said, every wall falls when truth strikes first. Eric knelt, rain washing the blood from his scar. Eric Hale said, the blade drank vengeance, but it leaves me empty. Thunder rolled softer, as if the storm had surrendered. The battlefield fell into silence, rain easing into mist. Eric Hale said, the storm is gone, yet its echo clings. Cale Thorne said, echoes remind us who survived. Old Eamon Grey said, and who did not. Ravens perched on broken spears, watching like judges. Eric touched the black blade, its glow fading. Eric Hale said, it drank vengeance, but it left me hollow. Old Eamon Grey said, hollows can be filled with purpose, not rage. Cale Thorne said, purpose needs walls rebuilt, not just walls broken. The mist thickened, carrying the smell of iron and wet earth. In the smoldering village, survivors gathered with torches low. Eric Hale said, you looked to me once and saw only shame. A man muttered, but no one stepped forward. Old Eamon Grey said, shame is past, but today he bought your breath. Cale Thorne said, and spilled his own to do it. Eric Hale said, if my hands built this ruin, let them build its rebirth. The crowd stirred, torn between anger and weary hope. Old Eamon Grey said, rebirth asks more than blood. It asks faith. Eric looked at the people, his scar a mark of oath. By the riverbank, Eric knelt where the water ran red with memory. Eric Hale said, I see faces in every ripple. Old Eamon Grey said, the river forgets, but we must not. Cale Thorne said, forget, and their deaths weigh nothing. Eric dipped the black blade into the current, its glow extinguished. Eric Hale said, it is only steel now, no more than I. Old Eamon Grey said, then let steel serve life, not vengeance. Cale Thorne said, and let scars guide, not blind. The river carried silence, as if granting absolution. At the edge of the pines, Eamon leaned heavy, breath shallow. Old Eamon Grey said, the spirit I carried leaves me now. Eric Hale said, stay, you are more than a spirit. Old Eamon Grey said, I am dust that walked long enough to guide you. Cale Thorne said, dust does not speak with wisdom. Eamon smiled faintly, setting staff into earth. Old Eamon Grey said, my part is done, the rest is yours. Eric Hale said, then I will carry your voice, even when silence takes you. His eyes closed, and the forest wind whispered farewell. On the high cliff above the fjord, Eric stood with cloak whipping in the wind. Eric Hale said, exile is done, I walk as my own. Cale Thorne said, and not alone. Below, the fjord shimmered in dawn light, washing scars with silver. Eric raised the black blade, now dull, and drove it into the earth. Eric Hale said, let it rest where vengeance ends. Silence followed, broken only by gull cries. Cale Thorne said, then we begin again, with new names carved in stone. The wind carried their words, weaving them into the horizon.